Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to tonight's meeting, 50 Years of Change for Farms and Rural Communities with Dr. John Ikerd. My name is Diane Rosenberg, and I'm the Executive Director of Jefferson County Farmers and Neighbors, JFAN, and the President of the Iowa Alliance for Responsible Agriculture, IRA. JFAN is a 501c3 community organization that works to protect Jefferson County from factory farms, and IRA is a coalition of about 30 community, state, and national organizations advocating for a factory farm moratorium. Tonight's meeting is brought to you by both JFAN and IRA, and I'm really glad you could be with us here tonight. I heard Dr. John Ikerd give this talk about 6 weeks ago. And although I thought I knew a lot about the history of agriculture over the past 50 years, it turns out I learned a whole lot more. It was especially eye-opening to learn just how much of our destructive agricultural system was deliberately set in motion. If we're ever going to change the system, and we must, it's important to know the hows and whys we got here, which is why I'm so pleased and grateful to Dr. Ikerd that he kindly agreed to do this meeting tonight. So I'm going to make a few brief announcements. In 2 weeks, JFAN is going to host another important and timely meeting, this time with Farm Action Fund President Joe Maxwell, and it's on the EATS Act. Now, this is a terrible federal bill being included with the Farm Bill that would negate California Proposition 12, and it has some widespread ramifications on states' rights, farmers' livelihoods, consumer choices, pesticide safety, and even national food sovereignty and security. In a nutshell, if passed, the EATS Act would eliminate the rights of any state to pass a law affecting animal agriculture and pesticides that could be more stringent than the weakest state law in the nation. It's truly a race to the bottom. So that meeting will be in a podcast forum. I'll be interviewing Joe, and he's been working tirelessly to defeat the EATS Act, and we'll be exploring all aspects of this proposed legislation. So this will take place on Wednesday, August 7th at 7 p.m. Central via Zoom. And you'll find the link to register in the chat box. Second, JFAN is currently planning our annual meeting for the first part of October. This year, I'm excited to be featuring a multi-generational family of Nyman Ranch farmers, former CAFO operators, who switched over to a traditional independent farming system. They'll be talking about their experiences as CAFO owners and now as traditional independent farmers, and why they made the decision to change and what it took to do that. We'll be setting the date shortly, so stay tuned for announcements about that. I also want to let you know about a meeting that the Iowa Alliance, IRA, is organizing for the beginning of November on the relationship between CAFOs and cancer, water quality, and food quality. That meeting will be held in Iowa City. We're still in the planning stages. It's going to be a really good meeting. So watch for some information that will be coming on that as well. Finally, next week, JFAN will roll out our annual fundraising drive. JFAN is a 501c3 grassroots funded community organization, and your community support enables us to bring you meetings like these to advocate on the state level for better factory farm regulations and a factory farm moratorium, and very importantly, to keep a constant watchful eye on any CAFO development in Jefferson County where we can jump into action if requested. And that's just a smattering of the work we do. JFAN has a fraction of the hogs that you'll find in our surrounding counties. And the work we've done has helped to shield Jefferson County from becoming another Washington County with a whopping 1.4 million hogs. We've been around since 2005. We get noticed, and we're a force. A Forbes article published yesterday even cited JFAN for the work we do. So we have another $27,000 match this year. So your donation dollars, all of which are critical to our operating budget, will be doubled until September 1st. We can only do this work with your support. So if you like what we're doing, I strongly encourage you to give as generously as possible tonight and during this fundraising drive. You'll find a link in the chat to our donation page, and your donations are eligible for tax deductions. And I want to thank you for helping to make JFAN possible and for allowing us to thrive. A quick mention about the format of tonight's meeting. Dr. Ikerd will give his presentation and will follow it with a Q&A session afterward. So I ask that you put all your questions only in the Q&A box and not in the chat, so I can actually see the questions. If they're put in the chat, we're not going to be able to answer those questions, but we will go through as many as possible that are in the Q&A box. Now, I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. John Ikerd. Dr. Ikerd is a professor emeritus at the University of Missouri at Columbia, and he's a highly celebrated agricultural economist, author, and public advocate for economic sustainability. He's worked in private industry, and during the first half of his academic career, he advocated for industrial agriculture. But when he saw how this system was hurting farmers, rural communities, and the environment, Dr. Ikerd became one of its fiercest critics. Dr. Ikerd is a prolific author. He's written 7 books, he's written chapters in over 20 books, and he's got a large library of papers. He's a sought-after speaker, both nationally and internationally. And if you have ever heard Dr. Ikerd speak before, you know what a powerful speaker he is. I had the great fortune to work with him for 15 years when he was a JFAN board member until his move last year to Illinois. So without further ado, Dr. Ikerd, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane. I really appreciate this opportunity to be here with you tonight. I wish I could be with everyone in person. I'd really like to do it better that way, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share my thoughts with you anyway. I've developed a PowerPoint presentation to go through it because I'm going to cover a lot of statistics and I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. And I found that that's the best way to deal with issues like this or deal with situations where we're online. If I can get the things going here. So I want to talk about 50 years of change in farms and rural communities. Now, those of you that know me know that I've been around a lot more than 50 years. So I'm speaking from firsthand experience when I talk about this period of time that I'm talking about, and I'll go back a little bit further than that. But I think that's kind of my kind of comparative advantage these days, is to talk about the experiences that happened over the years. But I always like to start off by saying that what I'm talking about tonight is my perspective or my truth. Because I don't think any of us should be so arrogant as to think that only we have the truth. So our individual truths comes from our unique perspectives and our unique experiences. And if those have led you to different conclusions or different perspectives than mine, that's fine with me. I just think by sharing our individual truth, our truth, then together we get closer to the truth. But if you're going to understand my truth and my perspectives, you need to know a little bit about my background. And I realize that a lot of you on the program tonight may already know this, and Diane's talked about a bit of it, but I think I'll cover it very quickly because I think it's relevant to the changes that we've seen. In the early years on the farm, when I was growing up on a small family farm down in southwest Missouri in the 40s and the 50s, it was a community that was made up of family farms, small diversified family farming operations, because it took families to farm in those days. And it was also a situation where we basically had a local food system. What we didn't raise on the farm, we got from other operations or other food operations that were close by. We had local canneries, we had local flour mills, we had local locker plants for livestock operations. I would guess that probably 85, 90% of the food that we ate when I was growing up came within 40 or 50 miles of our house. And we had vibrant rural communities because in those days, it took more than a family to run a farm, particularly at harvest time. So we had communities of what I call necessity, where you'd have large harvest crews come with the threshing machines and filling silos and things of this nature. And that led to strong social communities as well. I was fortunate enough back in those days that even a poor kid could go to state university. So I was able to go to the University of Missouri after I graduated from high school. I graduated there in 1961, and I did a short stint in the Army Reserves and then worked at the Kansas City Stockyards for a while. But I spent 3 years then working with Wilson Packing Company, which that time was the third largest meat packer in the country. But I decided that wasn't where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. So I come back in 1970. I had a PhD from the University of Missouri. And I followed that with a 30-year academic career as an agricultural economist. I always had a partial or at least a half-time extension appointment. So I spent that time out working with farmers. It was in the 1980s, as Diane mentioned in the introduction, that I had to rethink what I taught and what I was teaching farmers as I went out around the country, because we were faced with a situation where the things that I had been taught and the outcomes I expected weren't coming true, and I was forced to change my mind. And so I changed my mind. I had to change my career in the second half of my academic career. Since then, I've been supporting what I call sustainable agriculture through its various phases of organics and so on. I retired from the University of Missouri in 2000, and since that time, I've continued to write and speak whenever I have opportunities on the sustainability of family farms and in rural communities. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. So I want to talk about the last 50 years, primarily starting in the 70s, but let's set the stage for change, about the transition and the changes that have happened in the last 50 years. It was the new technologies that come out of World War II that made what I now call the industrialization of agricultural policy and are possible, and the transition from those diversified family farms to what I call industrial agriculture today. It was the affordable farm tractors that replaced the horses on the farms. When I was in the earliest years of my life, I can remember farming with horses, though I never did it myself. And then it was the relatively cheap nitrogen fertilizer and the synthetic pesticides that allowed farmers to move away from the diversified crop rotations and integrated crop and livestock systems and just focus on either crops or livestock and then on a single species of crop and livestock. But it was really the changes in farm policy that made the transition that it was possible because of the technology. The change in farm policies made it inevitable. And it's those changes that continue today that basically continue to make the industrial agricultural operations that we see today inevitable as long as we have these farm policies. This quote comes from a report of the Committee on Economic Development, which was a prestigious committee that was put together that claims credit for the Bretton Woods Agreement on currency relationships between countries and led to the World Bank and the International Credit Association, the International Bank, and so on. But in 1962, they developed a subcommittee on agriculture to develop what they called an adaptive program for agriculture, which is the subject of the report. And this is a direct quote from that 1962 report. They pointed to the fact that the technologies come out of World War II had allowed farmers to farm larger farms, and which had led to fewer farms, and that there was a movement of people out of agriculture even up to the 1960s. But they said the movement of people from agriculture has not been fast enough to take full advantage of the opportunities that these improved farm technologies and increased capital have created. The CED report then proposed this adaptive approach that they called it, and they said that we need to utilize positive government actions to facilitate and promote the movement of labor and capital where they're most effective or most productive, which means out of agriculture. They set a specific goal that they wanted farm policies to move 1/3 of the farmers in the US off farms within a 5-year period. Those proposed changes were implemented. It basically developed a blueprint for the policies that we've had since that time. Those proposed changes were implemented as validated in a 1979 report that went back and showed how the USDA had put those into place. They reduced the price supports as less control on production and supply management, which they used supply management to keep prices at what they call near parity prices up to that point in time. So they relaxed those controls to allow farmers to produce more. They lowered the commodity support prices that had been there since they were initiated in the 1930s. And then what we result of that was the logical thing. We had fewer farmers, larger farms, And they achieved what was the intent of that report to begin with, and what has remained the primary driving force in agricultural policies at that time is to achieve the economies of scale of large-scale industrial production, specialized, standardized consolidation of control into larger and larger farming operations. But as the large farms got larger, the farms get fewer, and each farm job supports about 3 non-farm jobs. Some estimates are much higher than this. That's a very conservative estimate. So as those farmers left rural communities, as the farms got larger and fewer, it meant the rural communities had fewer employment opportunities. And the rural communities suffered as farm population declined by over 50% from 1950 to 1970. And a big part of that was due to those changes in policy. They said afterward that they achieved the goals of moving farmers out of agriculture. In the early 1970s, then, after they had kind of gone to more of a free market approach and removed the production controls, what we ended up with then is overproduction, a surplus of grain production in the early 70s, and we had surplus production and depressed prices. Well, at that time was the Nixon-Butz administration came in that followed the changes in foreign policies in the 1960s, and they went even further toward the free market policies. And they said, if we have surplus production, it means we got lower prices, we're more competitive in world markets. And so they set about freeing up global markets and emphasized the export of the surplus production. It was the Russian grain deal of 1975 that got the biggest amount of that attention at that time, but they were opening markets all across the world. The whole idea was, with Earl Butz in particular, was we're going to feed the world, plant fence row to fence row, all out production. We're going to feed the world, we're going to eliminate hunger and make good food affordable for everybody. But during this time, the rural communities continued to suffer as the farms got larger. They have been more efficient, producing more per farm, but the population in rural communities, the farm population, dropped another 14% between 1970 and 1976. The strong export markets, though, and rising prices in the late 1970s brought about a change in agriculture, where this is about the time that I was at North Carolina State University when I started out my career there in the late 1970s, and these were prosperous times in agriculture because we'd opened up the export markets and things were booming. We had record high grain prices, we had rising farmland prices. It seemed like a time of prosperity. You know, I was an agricultural economist. It seemed like these were going to be a good 30 or 40 years with me in the university and supporting this prosperous move that we had made in agriculture, basically during my academic career, at least through my education academic career. We did have some clouds on the horizon, the oil embargo of 1963, and then the Iran revolution in 79 had led to a reduction in overall energy supplies of petroleum output, which led to record high inflation rates going into the late 1970s. Now, 1970s was also a decade of turbulence in the livestock market, as well as the ups and downs that I've talked about in grain markets primarily. This was about the time that the fast foods really came onto the scene. McDonald's, KFC, Pizza Hut, those had started in the 60s, or really earlier than that, some of them, but they really began to come into their own during this period of time as we began to talk about, you know, moving toward a fast food nation. We talked specifically, I was in Oklahoma about this time, working with the big commercial feedlots out in the Oklahoma Panhandle, but we talked about, there was a lot of talk of the hamburger society. One of my responsibilities out there was organizing the Oklahoma Cattle Feeders Conference. And 1 year at that conference, there was a cattle feeder that said, I don't think we'll ever lose money raising cattle again because we can't meet the growing demand for beef in this society today. Beef prices did go up. There was a strong demand, particularly coming from the fast food sector, but also straight across the board. President Nixon then came in 1973 and put a price freeze. I think it was a 90-day price freeze on beef prices because they were going up so fast. Cattle feeders held back. They said, okay, prices are going up. As soon as the freeze is over, then we'll sell at high prices. But after they lifted the price freeze, they found out they had more cattle than the market would absorb. And so then when we saw cattle prices fall, Well, another thing that we saw during the early 70s when we had higher beef prices and pork prices, then chicken become a major source of meat because chicken was a cheap alternative to the red meats in the market. Pork prices or pork began to lose market share to both beef and chicken because of the rising demand for beef and the lower price of chicken left pork basically in a situation where they didn't have any comparative advantage. But livestock prices then, after they went down following the price freeze, then they began to rebound going into the late 1970s. And so they were going up right along with the price of grain and everything at that time. But the 1980s then came with the decade of the farm financial crisis. Because with the rising inflation rates, then we also had inflated cost of farm inputs, particularly those that are petroleum-based, like the fertilizers and fuel and this sort of thing that industrial agriculture is dependent upon. And the talk in the latter years when I was at Oklahoma State, and the early years when I'd moved to the University of Georgia, was this idea of the cost price squeeze. Even though prices were at record high levels, costs were at even higher prices, and farmers were caught with not even high prices, but not being able to cover the cost of production. And so a lot of farmers then borrowed money, went into the market or went to the bank and borrowed money to meet their cash flow needs. And a lot of us so-called experts were telling farmers at that time, you don't really have an economic problem, you just have a cash flow problem. Land prices have gone sky high, you just borrow against the higher land prices, meet your cash flow needs, and some of these days, then all this stuff will straighten out and you'll be in good shape. But then we had a surprise in the early 80s. We began the loss of export markets. We had the Russian grain embargo then in 1980, and we had a sharp drop then in the export markets, which began to dampen prices. But the higher interest rates was really the thing that resulted in the loss of the global export markets, which led to a global recession. But also with high interest rates on the US dollar, it meant that US grain prices were priced out of competitive situation when it came to the global grain market situation. So they lost the exports very sharply. And the 1985 Farm Bill came along then when farmers were already feeling the pinch of the desperate times. And rather than go back to supporting prices or reducing production or whatever, they basically kind of cut a deal with the people that were interested in conservation programs, and would be the environmental programs today, but conservation title was brought in then, which did a lot of positive things, the sort of soil erosion, the CRP program, and this sort of thing. But basically, those were strategies to try to limit the production by taking land out of grain production primarily and putting it in CRP. But they didn't lower price support. So they're still committed to this sort of free market philosophy of let's let the market adjust and let's just go toward focusing on economic efficiency because competition in the market will force us to be more efficient in agriculture. But when we got into this situation then with farmland, with commodity prices dropping and still going on and drying up in the export markets, then the price of farmland began to drop. And from 1984 to 1987, we saw fall in farmland prices of 25%. I remember when people were saying we'll never see farmland prices go down again. They hadn't gone down since the Great Depression, but they certainly did between 84 and 1987. And we had farmers then that were caught with these large debts that they'd built up to meet their cash flow needs because of the price record high interest rates, 14, 15, 16%. And then they had no equity in the farm because the value of the farmland had dropped. This led to the crisis in rural communities. It wasn't just on the family farms because it's all tied together. We saw the farm foreclosures, the bankruptcy, farm suicides. As I said, I was in University of Georgia at that time in the Extension Service as head of the Extension Agricultural Economics Department. It's our responsibility to go out and try to help these farmers save their farms. We'd have them bring in their records, try to figure out some way to get out of debt, or at least borrow more money, or some way make it through, or at least try to talk them out of committing suicide. Because suicides were basically farm foreclosures and bankruptcy and suicides was just kind of regular on the network news shows at that time. During that period of time, many farming counties lost about 20% of their population if they were dependent on farming. The state of Iowa, which is probably as dependent on farming as anywhere, lost 5% of their population between 1970 and 1980. The rest of the country was up 10. Iowa went down 15% in population relative to the rest of the country. There were too few farm families left to support the communities out here in these areas. Many rural communities lost their banks. They lost their main street businesses, their car dealerships, their equipment dealerships, their grocery stores. And there was not enough people there to keep the doctors or keep the schools open. When they lose their school, not enough people to go to church. A farm community is not just about economic output. It's about the people. You need people to support rural communities. And those people were there because the farms were there and the farms were successful. During the 1980s, that was the opposite. The surviving forage farm operations bought their inputs elsewhere and traded elsewhere. They weren't contributing to the community. And many farming towns during the 1980s became ghost towns. When I came to the University of Missouri in the end of 1980s, all across North Missouri, you'd drive through towns with all the main streets basically boarded up and shut down. 1990s, they didn't give up. They continued to carry on with farm programs that were these market-oriented programs they talked about. The 1990 Farm Bill gave farmers new flexibility. It basically lowered support prices again, still kind of force more competitiveness and more efficiency in agriculture, gave them new flexibility. They could plant anything they want to, rather than having a certain base acres of wheat or corn or soybeans or whatever. They could use the land for whatever they thought to be more profitable. And they thought, well, it's more of a free market kind of concept. And so that's what farmers will do to support their farm operation. They could support anything other than fruits and vegetables that time because they didn't want to flood the market with those other commodities. And 1996 was a discontinuation of production controls altogether. This is a point in time when they said, okay, if you've got a USDA base acres of anything, then you get paid regardless of whether you plant the crop or regardless of what you plant. Because they discontinued the production controls, you can produce as much as what you want. This is called the Freedom to Farm Bill in the 1996 Farm Bill, but it became the Freedom to Fail. Anytime they put farmers in a situation where they're producing for the market and they allow them to go all out toward these large specialized farming operations, then they end up just oversupplying the market with production and prices both begin to fall. And by the year 2002, when the new Farm Bill came up, then there was so much public outcry again from the farm crisis again. I wrote a paper one time that said, you know, agriculture is in a chronic situation of crisis. It's just every few years we go through these transitions, kind of like a roller coaster where we take agriculture to the top and then we take it down to the bottom. And that's when we shake out the farmers, is when we get to the bottom. And so when we hit the bottom in the late 90s, then the 2002 Farm Bill restored and expanded the subsidies and went in a new direction. They said, okay, rather than regulate markets, because they determined they weren't going to go back to supporting market prices again, what they do is they let the market set the prices and then the government offsets prices below. When prices are below the cost of production, or what they see as cost of production, they offset it with what they call deficiency payments now. Then they call it reference payments, they call it various other things. But it's basically allowing the markets to seek world market price levels and then compensating the farmers from the difference so that these large commercial operations can continue to make money regardless of how low the global prices go. Farmers then were encouraged to increase production for exports and for livestock feeding. It was still farm policies for all-out production. As we saw as a result of this also, with this corporate industrialization of agriculture, is kind of the corporatization. We saw the corporatization of livestock production take place first. We saw the Department of Justice then really come on in the 1980s, but we saw the impact in the 90s of what they call the consumer welfare antitrust policy philosophy. That basically says that if we're having consolidation of two firms joined together or one gets larger, if we think it's going to result in lower prices for consumers, we don't care how large it gets or whether it gets a monopoly of the market or whatever. If there's not collusion and we think prices are going down, particularly if there's a wider variety of products available, such as Walmart and other people are offering, we're not going to be concerned about how large the firm gets as long as it's offering lower prices. We saw during this period of time then the old packers replaced, like the Wilson Armor Cudahy and Wilson and Cudahy. Swift Armor, Wilson and Cudahy were the big four. We saw them replaced, like with IBP and ConAgra. XL became the major beef packers. We saw Smithfield come in, and Tyson, Swift, that was been bought out later by someone else, but in Cargill began to dominate the pork sector. Tyson, Pilgrim Pride, Purdue, large corporations controlled the poultry sector. Contract hog feeding followed poultry feeding, which really started off with contract CAFOs, but we saw the same thing coming with contract hog feeding that followed CAFOs and during this period of time in the 90s. The beef packers controlled the markets even when they with captive supplies, even though they were prevented from actually owning the cattle. What they would do is tie up supplies well ahead of time so that they knew what was coming in. And unless you were working in a relationship with the beef packer, you'd find out that you had no market for your cattle once they were ready to go to market. Vertical integration then, where we saw the packers, in some cases even the retailers, integrating all the way back to production level. Whether it was through contracts or through outright ownerships, they were in a situation then when you ended up with a surplus in the market, which periodically comes in agriculture, always has, and I think it always will. When you get profitable prices, you'll have surpluses. Instead of lowering retail prices and letting the market clear, what they would do is they keep their wholesale or retail prices up, and that would force the farm level prices lower and lower until they drove out even the most inefficient independent producers, and then they would allow the market to clear and move on up. 1990s in rural communities, all they were left to do was cope with the industrialization of agriculture and all of its consequences for rural communities. CAFOs, as we know, concentrate animals, profits, and waste all together in small places. That's basically, if you had to look at one thing which characterizes, one word which characterizes the profitability, I mean the CAFOs in general and the negative impacts, it would be concentration of too many animals, too much profit, too much waste, too much activity in one place for nature or the communities to absorb. The CAFOs communities then end up with polluted air and water. Other communities then that don't get the CAFOs, then they lose the family farms. You know, a lot of the CAFOs went into areas, when they went into North Carolina, there weren't all that many hog producers there to begin with. And so what they do is they concentrated activity there. But then when they were coming into places like Iowa and Missouri, they were displacing the independent family farms. But even when it's not in an area where you have the independent family farms somewhere are being forced out of business when you go to larger and larger and fewer operations. And without animals on the farm, when you went to CAFOs, then the grain farms were forced to get bigger and to get fewer in order to support the farm families, because it was the livestock operations that typically added value to the grain and made those operations viable for the family farmers. Smaller independent family farms then were forced to rely on off-farm income just to survive. And I'll give some figures later on how dependent we have become on. And then this is during the 90s also, we saw organic farming and local food systems grow. And they grew primarily as alternatives for those farmers that could no longer compete with the government subsidized industrial agricultural system. We get into the 2000s then. We have another kind of roll on the roller coaster. Japan had a financial crisis at this time in the late 1990s that caused depression of the global markets. And we were all set going into the 2000s then with the George W. Bush administration coming in for adjustments. They said they were going to go back to more of a market-oriented, again, approach on farm policies. But then we had the Middle East wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the Farm Bureau and others come through and basically said, this is how we save the support for the industrial farming operations. We can't be cutting subsidies for farmers during wartime. And so we continued to increase the subsidies that went into the large industrial operations. And the farm policies at that time shifted towards subsidizing crop insurance rather than direct payments, because there were organizations, nonprofit organizations, that were making people aware of the fact that a lot of these big farm subsidies were going to people that weren't farmers at all, or people that weren't on farms at all, just big corporate operations. And so they said, okay, we'll just subsidize crop insurance. Nobody can be opposed to, subsidizing insurance of production so that the farmer ends up with crop failure and they're not driven out of business. And so they shifted over farm policies into crop insurance. And then about that same time, they were still producing surpluses. And so they decided we'll go to corn ethanol because we've got energy situation because of the wars in the Middle East, and we've got energy shortages, so we'll go to renewable energy from corn ethanol. So we ended up during the 2000s then with about 40% of the US corn crop going into ethanol rather than going to either export markets or otherwise, in addition to feeding the livestock. The global food crisis then of 2008 was kind of led by the fact that putting the corn crop into ethanol that inflated crop prices and then led to inflated food prices. And then we also had a period of speculation in commodities of almost every kind, including farmland prices. And so that led to rising agricultural prices and a global food crisis. Farmland prices followed them up. As commodity prices went up, then we saw farmland prices go up. And this is the first time they went back to pre-1980 levels. And then we got into the global economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. That's when the global financial system kind of imploded and began to come down after its rapid rise during that period of time. It led to increasing uncertainty about whether or not we were going to come back. And the farm financial crisis, or the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, was felt more severely out in rural areas than it was in urban areas. Depressed rural employment and incomes more than it did in urban areas. So once again, we saw rural communities really hit with a negative blow. The negative impacts were greatest in the Midwest because that was the most agricultural dependent area of the country. And we saw corporate domination of agriculture continue to extract the wealth from rural communities, because it's not the rural communities that benefit, even though their agricultural sector is growing and the productivity and the local economy is growing. The benefits from those increased productivity and profitability of industrial operations go elsewhere. They go into the corporate headquarters, or the people that don't live in the communities live somewhere else. We saw the immigration then of foreign workers that come in to work in the CAFOs and horticultural farms began to offset the out-migration of cities into rural areas. So we began to really see a change then in the composition of rural communities. I've said on many occasions that I thought if there's anything positive to come out of CAFOs, we're going to end up with more culturally diverse rural communities than we had before, which I see as a positive factor. But it wasn't necessarily a positive factor for the rural communities, because many of the people that come didn't intend to stay and they didn't make it their home. But those that have continued to be as positive, but you have a transient that's totally different in terms of the rural communities of the past. With the transit population, it's temporary, at least a high percentage is temporary. But the median incomes in rural areas were still higher, and the poverty rates were still lower than they were in many urban areas, at least up to that time. If we look at what happened to the corporate control of agri-system during the 2010s, it's kind of a rule of thumb that if among economic circles, that if 4 corporations control 40% or more of the market, then the market's no longer competitive, because when you get that few of firms, in reality, they don't even have to conclude with each other through formal agreements or through telephone conversations. They all know what each other's doing, and they go through these periods of raising prices, or sometimes they have cutthroat competition, but basically they're not going to do anything that destroys their ability to extract as much profit as possible from the people that they're from their customers and from their suppliers. Mary Hendrickson, University of Missouri, and several other people for a long time have been tracking corporate consolidation in the agri-food system. In a 2021 report, which went back through the 2010s, this is what they came up with, is that these firms here, JBS, Markbig, what used to be National Beef, Tyson, Cargill, control 73% of the US beef processing. Swift, or JBS, which now owns Swift and a bunch of the others, it's bought out. Cargill, the WH Group, which bought out Smithfield, Harmel, controls 67% of pork processing. Tyson, JBS, Purdue, Sanderson, 54% of chicken processing. Kellogg, General Mills, Post, 83% of cold cereals. Walmart, Kroger, Albertson, Costco, 45% of groceries. And McDonald's, Yum Brands, which owns Taco Bell and KFC and Pizza Hut, Wendy's and Subways controlled 39% of the fast food market. So we see the corporate control of the agri-food system. And by 2020, and then 1/3 of the total value of agriculture production was under corporate contract, even if it wasn't owned by the corporations, it was under corporate contract. But if you look at pork and poultry, then 90% of the poultry, 75% of the hogs, and for 50% of the cattle were under contracts of one kind or another. So it was really the corporations calling the shots. And in these comprehensive contracts on pork and poultry, for example, it's basically the corporation that dictates everything from the feed to the health practices to when the hogs come or chickens come, when they leave, and all aspects of the management. Corporate processors basically dictate production process to large independent producers, even if they aren't under contract. Because if you're a large operation and want to sell to one of these large processors, then you have to meet the same specifications basically as their contract producers do. So you've basically given up your independence once you decide that you want to go for this large scale farming kind of operation. And what we ended up with is there's no competitive markets left for the smaller independent producers, the diversified crop and livestock farmers. Those markets are basically gone. To the extent that they exist, they're just fill-ins for the product that's under contract. I don't know whether it's still there, but I know in Iowa they used to even quote two prices. One of them would be kind of the rail price or the cutout price for the things that were for animals that were under contract, and those that were in the free market, so to speak, they're picking up from the independent producers would always be significantly lower than those that were paid for people that we had on contract for their regular suppliers. So the small farmers then were forced to produce for the organic or local niche markets during the 1980s. And this is when the organic market began to grow leaps and bounds. We saw the local food system come in as farmers again were scrambling for some way to stay in business or to get into farming, with everything going toward this large industrial operation. The 2010s, the farms grow larger and fewer still. The 2017 census came out indicating that from 2007 to 2017, total farm numbers were down 3%, but the loss was in the mid-sized farms. The large farms were growing, and we were seeing more of the small farms with the organic farmers and the alternative farmers and direct marketing farmers coming in, but the mid-sized family farmers were continuing to disappear. By that time, we saw the largest 4% of farms own 58% of the farmland, about 4% of the farm. The largest 5% of farms produce 75% of total agricultural production. The largest 10% get 80% of the government program subsidies. The largest 12% be 96% of net farm income. I talked earlier about farmers having to rely on off-farm income. Farm income makes up less than 25% of the total family income. For farm operators that say their primary occupation is farming, it's less than 5%. And for about 40% of farmers who say they have other occupations because they can't make a living farming, farming accounts for less than 10%. So what farming contributes to incomes is far less than the amount of sales that are going to different farms. And the loss of family farm numbers compares nothing to the small number of farms today that actually will support a family. Wendell Berry, in a 2017 response to the book editors of New York Times, summed up what's happened as well as anything I've seen. He says that the business of America has been largely and without policy, the plundering of rural America, from which everything of value, minerals, timber, farm animals, farm crops, and labor, has been taken at the lowest possible price, as apparently none of the enlightened ones have seen flying over or bypassing on the interstate highway. Its two large fields are toxic and eroded. Its streams and rivers are poisoned. Its forests mangled. Its towns dying and dead, along with the locally owned small businesses. Its children leaving after high school and not coming back. Too many of its children are not working at anything. Too many are transfixed to various screens. Too many are on drugs. Too many are dying. A 2017 Wall Street Journal article was entitled, "Rural America, the New Inner City." And I quote from that. It started starting in 1980s, the nation's basket cases were in the urban areas, where the toxic stew of crime, drugs, and suburban flight conspired to make large cities the slowest growing and most troubled places. Today, however, a Wall Street Journal analysis shows that by many key measures of socioeconomic well-being, these charts have flipped. In terms of poverty, college attainment, teenage births, divorce, death rates from heart disease and cancer, reliance on federal disability insurance, male labor force participation. Rural communities now rank among the lowest, the worst among the four major US population groups, below the inner cities. That's what the transformation of agriculture has done, from the diversified independent family farms to the large industrial farming operations, agricultural operations, I wouldn't even call them farms, that we have today, and the consolidation of the agribusiness corporations. That's the legacy of the 50 years of farm policy. The unintended consequences were, the farm and food policy. Nobody set out to bring about these results. I really believed in the early years of my career that what we were going to do is increase the efficiency and profitability of agriculture. It'd be good for innovative farmers. We'd have profitable farms, profitable rural communities. We'd make good food affordable for everybody by bringing down the cost of production and food prices. But it didn't work. The problem is not that we made a mistake, is the problem is we go on refusing decade after decade to correct it. A UN panel of experts on sustainability, and there's numerous UN studies that confirm all of these things. And a 2016 report summed it up as well as about anybody, I think. They say today's food and farming systems have succeeded in supplying large volumes of food to global markets, but they're generating negative outcomes on multiple fronts: widespread degradation of land, water, and ecosystems, high greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity losses, persistent hunger and micronutrient deficiencies, alongside the rapid rise in obesity and diet-related diseases, and livelihood stresses for farmers around the globe. They say what is required is a fundamentally different model of agriculture, based on diversifying farms and farming landscapes, replacing chemical inputs, optimizing diversity, and stimulating interactions between different species as part of a holistic strategy to build long-term soil fertility, healthy natural ecosystems, and secure livelihoods. They point out, and I think this is critically important, that the data shows that these systems can compete with industrial agriculture in terms of global total output, performing particularly strongly under environmental stress and delivering production increases in places of the world where additional food is desperately needed. Diversified agroecosystems can also pave the way for diverse diets and improved health. And they go on to say it's not a lack of research, it's not a lack of knowledge of what needs to be done. It's that the policy process globally is being controlled by the large agribusiness corporations, and that needs to change. So what about the next 50 years for farms and rural communities? These are some observations from the author Margaret Wheatley, which I think a lot of you probably know, is a respected writer and speaker and a thoughtful person in many of these things, and talks about really transformational change a good bit. And she was giving a talk at the University of Wisconsin, and she actually went on a retreat for a while to think about, the situation she was going to come and talk about. And she said she'd come to three basic conclusions: that there was a growing sense of impotent and dread about the nation. They said also that there's the realization that information doesn't change minds anymore. And I think that's very important. I've quoted a lot of statistics here tonight, and I've drawn a lot of conclusions, but there's a lot of people that just say that's all nonsense, because people don't know what to believe anymore. But the third one was, she said that, I think this is most important, that she came away with the clarity that world changes through local communities taking action, and that there's no power for change greater than a community taking the future into its own hands. She said that global change always begins when small local efforts that then connect with other small local efforts. And after many years of hard work and experimentation and learning together, these small efforts suddenly emerge into a powerful global system of influence. I'm convinced that that's the only way we're going to change this, is when people within these rural communities and communities elsewhere decide to take control of their own destinies, to change things, to change their communities and link up with other communities. One of the most encouraging things to me, and again, now another advantage of being old, is that I know that we know more about the viable alternatives to industrial agriculture today than we knew about industrial agriculture 50 years ago. We know about how to produce the things that were quoted in the UN report. The sustainable agriculture movement now is, the organic movement's been around since the 1960s, sustainable agriculture movement since the 1980s, the local foods movements. So we've had permaculture, we've got holistic resource management, we've got ecological agriculture, biological agriculture, more recently regenerative agriculture. These are all grown in popularity because they are alternatives to industrial agriculture that don't create the environmental and the social and the public health risks that are threats that are associated with industrial agriculture. We know what to do instead of industrial agriculture. We didn't know that 50 years ago. My first glance of industrial agriculture was the old steam engine that powered the threshing machine that chugged by the grade school. The teacher would let us out so we could watch it go from farm to farm. That's what industrial agriculture looked like when I was a kid. And it did look different in the 1960s when we had the change in policy, but we could not have imagined in the 1960s what agriculture would look like today. I just was out in North Dakota and talking to some farmers out there, some retired farmers, and they say combines out there are selling for $1 million. $1 million combine? Who could have imagined that? A tractor to drive itself across the field. The change must begin in local communities where people care about each other and they're committed to taking care of their niches within nature, their places, the places where they live. That's what it takes to change, is caring people, coming together, taking care of each other and taking care of their communities. People ask me all the time, they say, well, are you optimistic about the future? And my standard answer is, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. Václav Havel, the Czech philosopher and playwright and former leader of the Czech, president of the Czech Republic, wrote about hope. He said, hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. It's this hope above all that gives us strength to live and to continually try new things, even in conditions that to others seem hopeless. I have hope. I know that what we're trying to do makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. It makes sense. In that, there is hope. And finally, he finished up and he says, life is too precious a thing to permit its devaluation by living pointlessly, emptily, without meaning, without love, without hope. I refuse to give up. I have hope. The change we made may not be quick and easy, but I know that it's possible. So I have hope. So that's my truth. So how about yours? Let's go back to stop my screen sharing and come back and see where we go from there, Diane.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ikerd. It's a very sobering history of agriculture in this country, in the world, really. But I think that, for many of us that are working to change things, we all have hope too, because that's what we see, what can be possible, and we want to realize that as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of good questions. I want to ask one question before I start diving into these questions. So at the very beginning of your talk, you talked about, the Committee for Economic Development and how, this whole almost kind of like a domino effect that, set all of this in motion. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about who is behind that, and also the whole development of the chemical nitrogen fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, how that related to World War II and the bomb making, that, you know, all these chemicals that were left over from that.
Well, let me start with the technologies, and I'm not an expert on this, but I've read from people who are experts on it. But anyway, as I always put it, it was the farm tractors, affordable farm tractors. You had farm tractors before them, but as I remember, the only farm tractor I saw when I was growing up, when I was in grade school, was an old rusty farm tractor with steel wheels that sat out in the field because nobody would use it. It was unusable. So they had the farm tractors, and then some people would try to make farm tractors out of old truck chassis and things like that. But when we got the affordable farm tractors, it was really out of the factories that had been making Jeeps and tanks, that after World War II, then they shifted over and started, farm tractors were kind of a logical transition from making a tank or a Jeep or something like that. And so they shifted over, and then those factories started turning out affordable farm tractors, and that's what made that available. And then it was the munitions plants that are involved in nitrates, that are involved in the explosives. And so they had the systems in of making nitrogen, taking nitrogen out of the air. They'd been using it to make TNT, and they turned it over and started making nitrogen fertilizer. And then it was the chemical warfare that led to the pesticides, the insecticide primarily came out of the chemical warfare technology that would designed to kill people, but they designed chemicals to kill insects out of that. So all of that was kind of the important things that came out of that. Now the Committee for Economic Development then was made up primarily of big corporate executives and university presidents and other people, kind of a big think tank that had been put together. And as I explained, kind of stumbled through it, but they take responsibility for this. I said this Bretton Woods agreement, which is they moved away from fixing currency rates and designed the current floating currency rates among nations and things of that nature. And then it was the International Monetary Fund that I couldn't think of, and the World Bank, that all came out of that. So it's a big think tank that pull together, that think about big issues and how you design policies to address the big issues. And so they pulled together this subcommittee then on agriculture, and it was made up primarily of the corporate executives, agribusiness corporate executives and people like that. But then the real working committees were made up of agricultural economists and business CEOs of business and things of that nature. And so they were the ones that developed the report on agriculture. And their whole idea was, they said, okay, these new technologies, then they make it possible for us to what I would call now industrialized agriculture. We can apply the same sort of management strategies in farming that we're applying now in manufacturing, if we use these new technologies. And then we've got, with the capital, we can get the capital to finance the technologies and for bigger farms and that sort of thing. So that's what they're talking about with the capital. And so then they developed this plan that says, okay, what we've got to do is move away from this idea of supporting independent family farms to allow the markets to squeeze these farmers out. So we'll ratchet down support prices, we'll release production controls that we've been using to keep prices high enough to support farm families. And we'll move away from that, and then prices will go down to a global level, and we'll force out these inefficient small farm families. And then we'll have a much more efficient agriculture, and it will be more efficient use of agricultural resources. And then as we agricultural economists were told, and we told other people, well, we'll all be better off because these farmers will find better paying occupations elsewhere. Their best economic employment's not in agriculture, it's in doing something else. And, as I say, going back to the 80s, we didn't take into consideration, these farmers didn't want to leave. Now, the early years of the transition up through the 60s, I think were good. The times I was going through when we first got tractors and we didn't have to have horses, and we had a lot of things that took a lot of drudgery out of farming. And a lot of farmers that left then didn't want to farm. But by the time we got into the 70s, you had farmers that wanted to farm, that knew how to farm, and you were driving them off the farms. And that's where it changed. A lot of times you start off with something that's working that's good. That's doing good for people, and you just keep doing it after you should quit and do something else. And I think that's what we did then. But the whole idea was that they were going to focus on economic efficiency, and that's basically what's driven farm policy ever since. We do things. They do things to respond to public pressure on conservation, environmental issues, government food assistance. Those things are just to appease the public while they continue to focus on increasing productivity and profitability of agriculture. That's the main driving force. That's where most of the money goes. Well, other than the food assistance money, there's a lot of money goes there, but that's where the agricultural money goes. It's supporting more efficient agriculture through larger scale, more intensive production, consolidation, corporate consolidation.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to go up and down here. I have a question here. What would happen if farm subsidies and supports were incrementally removed from commodity crops?
Removed from commodity crops? Well, that's what the thing is right now, the commodity prices are going kind of be driven by world market prices. There are certain other things that keep it from that, but they allow the commodity prices to drop more toward world market prices. Now they just make up the difference between the two. The change that we need is to quit subsidizing these large industrial farming operations, which allows them to stay in business. I argue that if we did away with the commodity the commodity programs that we have now, the deficiency payments, I don't know what the terminology is now. They call it a reference price, but they pay for the difference between the reference price and the market price. If you did away from taking the risk out of agriculture, if you did away with subsidizing the crop insurance, then these big operations couldn't take the risk of functioning. While this large specialized, standardized, consolidated large operations may be very economically efficient, they're also very risky because you've got large amounts of capital invested in very specialized equipment. This $1 million combine that I was talking about, that's a lot of money for one piece of equipment that you're going to use for a few weeks of the year. But you've got a lot of money in specialized equipment, specialized buildings, facilities, and that sort of thing, and you're producing one commodity. And so if the market price drops to unprofitable levels and there's nothing to make up the difference between whatever the market price is and wherever it goes, or if you don't support prices at that level, there's a tremendous amount of risk there because agriculture is inherently risky. You can have drought, you can have flood, you can have late frost, you can have early frost, and various other things. You can have disease outbreaks, livestock operation, you can have disease outbreaks that wipe out the facilities, but right now, we have government programs that come in and absorb this risk. If they're not in price supports, if it's not in subsidized insurance that not only insures the yield, but also insures your price, so it basically insures the profits. We have disaster programs. If you have a major flood, we step in and have disaster programs. If you don't have insurance, if you have a disease come in and wipe out the chickens or the hogs in your capos, the government will come in, compensate you for the animals that are lost, clean up the facilities and put them back in. If we didn't have all these things, then you couldn't afford the risk. And that's the thing that's keeping them in business. And that's the reason I say foreign policies now is what's keeping industrial agriculture. It was the technologies that made it possible, but it was the foreign policies that made it possible to employ those technologies in the large operations that we have today. If you didn't have the government absorbing the risk, we've gotten in agriculture like we are in banking. We have farm operations that are too big to fail. So the government comes in and bails them out. But if we didn't have those, we would go towards smaller, more diversified farming operations just for risk management reasons. We'd have to weigh the riskiness of the resilience of the farming operation against profitability. In a purely free market economy, that's what you have to do. You have to weigh the resilience of the operation against the economic efficiency of specialization and economies of scale. And so you always have to work with those trade-offs. But if the government's taking the risk then you have no limit on expansion. And that's what we're into today. And that's the reason I say farm policies are the only thing that's propping up industrial agriculture today. It's not just, market price supports, it's a whole range of things. We also subsidize credit and make it easy for it to borrow loan, government guaranteed loans, and a whole range of things.
So as a follow-up question to that, someone's asking, why is it that normal supply and demand corrections don't apply to industrial agriculture? Did supply and demand agriculture work in the past when we had fairly self-sufficient local and regional food systems?
Well, supply and demand is working. That's one thing we get into. Supply and demand always works. It's just you can manipulate the supply or manipulate demand, so you're not really having a free market outcome. You're changing, either controlling the supply or you're influencing demand, one or the other, that you get these various outcomes that come through. And what was the best part of it? If we did away with all government programs whatsoever, we didn't have just a free market agriculture, we would go back to this period of time where we would be going through these roller coasters, as I've talked about before. My years as an agricultural economist, I was a livestock marketing specialist. So my job was forecasting livestock prices. And at that time, we always had cycles. We had hog cycles, we had cattle cycles. We didn't have enough chickens at that time to deal with chicken cycles, but we'd have those too. And what that comes from is that agriculture is an operation where you have to make decisions today and you don't have anything to sell until sometime in the future. Even in crop systems, you have that. And so when prices are generally high and it looks profitable, then you say, okay, I got to plant more, I'm going to produce more, and I'll make more profit. So you've got all the individual farmers out here. If you've got a large number of small farmers, as you would have in a competitive market without things that we're talking about, then you have the farmers saying, okay, we're going to increase production. And so if one or two of them did it, that'd be fine. But when the whole mess of farmers increase production, and they've started this production process that for hogs may be 6 months, or the breeding stock a year or two away, that you're going to get the final production out of it. And cattle, it's more like 8 or 10 years where you get the full production out of it. Okay, you started that process. And so those animals are in the system and they're going to come to market. When they come to market, all at once, there's going to be more product than the market will bear. You're going to produce more than consumers will buy, and you're going to have prices go down, and they're going to go down to unprofitable levels. And then when you go to unprofitable levels, then people are going to cut back on production. You're going to have scarcity. You're going to have high prices, and then that's going to take you through. And you're just going to go up and down in these prices. In the same way in grain, you have a good year in grain prices and so on. So you plant more grain, the next year you have a down year. And so the reason that no country in the world really leaves agriculture to the market forces. Virtually every country in the world has some sort of an agricultural policy, because they can't go through this period of feast and famine for the consumers, and prices go through the ceiling, and then prices go to low levels, and you force the farmers out of business, and you have to come back in. And particularly in dairy operations, it was even longer. Dairy prices were one of the first that were controlled, because in the dairy cow back then, it wasn't like now where cows were only used for 4 or 5 years. You use them for 10 or 12 years. So when you started the production process, you'd have surpluses of milk going for 10 or 15 years. And you just have to eventually force the farmers out. But anyway, so that's the inherent nature of agriculture, and that's kind of the reason we have farm policies. And what I've argued for is we ought to support farm families. We ought to go back to the original intent of agricultural policies in the 1930s. Parity prices basically were designed to ensure parity incomes for farm families. And I would say we need a farm family income insurance program. The government needs to transition or change the crop insurance program to a family farm income insurance program that says, okay, if you produce in an environmentally sound, socially responsible way, humane treatment of animals, the whole range of things we'd associate with regenerative, sustainable agriculture, then as a farm family, we'll ensure if you've got a full-time family farm, then your income will drop below the non-farm family income in your area. Now, if you make more than that, that's fine. We're not going to subsidize that. And, you'll have a certain period of time to ensure that you can make a profit in some years from this operation. But then that would stabilize the farm output, because you would ensure the families could stay there and continue to produce. And then it'd be to their advantage to diversify their operation, because they could go up various years and they would, they wouldn't have the big deep down areas. And so that's basically what farm programs were supposed to do in the 1930s and 40s. But then when we got where each individual family could produce more and more because of the technology, then that meant the parity prices. You would have ended up with farm incomes that were twice non-farm incomes, because the farms could be twice as big and produce twice as much. And if you had parity prices, a lot of people nowadays, I respect them, but they call for parity prices. That's basically what you would end up with, because technology's changed to the point we need to be talking about parity incomes rather than parity prices.
Good point. Got two questions here I'm going to kind of put together. So I'm curious to know how Missouri and Iowa farmland is priced today. And related to that, do you think that current high land prices are sustainable in light of low corn and soybean prices, big carryouts, and the threat that electric vehicles will depress ethanol use?
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on on farmland prices, but my opinion is that farmland prices are being driven to a great extent today by speculation on farmland. You got people that see farmland as a good investment for reasons other than just being able to farm it. And the other thing is, as long as you have the government basically ensuring that you don't have to lose money on it, then that's a really safe investment from an income standpoint. And then if you think the value of that investment is going to go up over time, then it becomes a good investment. But one of my biggest concerns right now is that we're going to end up, before we change farm policy, we're going to end up with large investment corporations that are going to come in and they're going to buy up farmland all the way from Texas to Canada. And then rather than using those $1 million combines, 2 or 3 weeks out of the year, they're going to move that equipment. I worked the wheat harvest one year. They're going to move that equipment to the farms in the South and move that equipment north, and then they'll move the planting equipment the same way, and they'll basically control big swaths of the whole country. And we already have that happening, where you have large operations that have hired farm crews that go from farm to farm rather than individual farmers. But I think they see the farmland as a good investment. It's basically a guaranteed income if you participate in the government programs, and then you got the prospect of land appreciation. And then, like most investors, they feel like is if things change significantly, then they can bail out and make a big profit on the farmland as a capital gain. I just don't think farming plays a big part in it. Again, I was talking to these farmers out in North Dakota, and they said the old relationship between rental prices and land values is totally out the window, or at least leasing prices. It says it's not about how much money you can make off the farm anymore. It's determined the pricing of it. It's not about the value of the farmland. It determines how it's priced, because the value is way out of line with what you can earn.
Here's a question. Given your deep knowledge of past changes in agriculture technology and how that implementation has changed rural communities and landscapes, what emerging technologies do you see having major impacts, and which should we be most actively questioning?
Yeah. Well, I would. Well, the technologies I see that have a negative impact is all of the robotization and digitization and all that kind of stuff. We're almost to the point where you don't even have to be close to the farm to farm it. Maybe you got somebody there in case the tractor runs rogue or something. You got to be able to shut it off, but you could probably do that from somewhere else. So you could set up headquarters in Minneapolis or Des Moines or Chicago or somewhere, and then you could farm land basically all across the country with robots and drones and that sort of thing. And maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration. That's not right around the corner, but we're certainly moving in that general direction, which means then you don't need farmers at all. You just basically have people that are running the machines. So you're moving in that direction, but there's a possibility, if we change the technology. Now, I was in the land grant university system. was there as in graduate school, come back to graduate school in 1965. So that's what, 50 years ago, something like that, or no longer than that, isn't it? Anyhow, 45, 25, yeah, 70, 70 years. No, maybe not that. But anyway, it's a long time. But I saw the change in the university system. The land-grant university system was set up to develop technologies that would support the independent family farms, and they were important in the early years of what I thought were the good years of the transition in agriculture, where they helped farmers increase their productivity, and farm tractors were coming in, and they helped farm families put in, get plumbing in their home and electricity in their homes, and it used to have the farm and home program, balanced farming program, balanced family living with conservation and profitability. That whole area there was to support the independent family farms. But I saw the transition in the kind of research that we did and the kind of extension work we did. We shifted over, and the university started developing what I now call industrial technologies. When we talk about technology development and transfer in the land grant university, it was industrial technologies we were developing as the industrial technologies we were transferring to farmers. We basically were promoting the farmers. If we had a change in public funding, whether it's the university system or wherever it is, to funding research and educational programs in the kind of technologies that would take the drudgery out of smaller, diversified, independent, organic, sustainable farming operations, take the drudgery out, but not the thinking. The technologies we're developing now with the robots and drones and stuff is taking the thinking out of it. It's concentrating the thinking in the people that develop the technologies and the people that run the computers. And what we need to do is leave the thinking on the farm, where the farmer knows their particular piece of land and the soil that they're working with and their animals and their crops, and adopts everything like an agroecology. When they were talking about that, it means that you look at the farm, individual farm, as an individual living system, with the plants and the animals and the things, the organisms in the soil, the farm and the farm family are all part of this integrated system. And so that's what you're managing. You're managing the farm as if you're taking care of a living thing. Now, if you had technologies that would take the drudgery out of that, so that you're not spending all your time pulling weeds, or you're not spending all your time doing repetitive tasks, that's done by technology, some machine, even a computer, even a robot, whatever. But you leave all of the thinking that's unique to the farm and the farm family in that particular location and the particular community. You leave all of that to the individuals that's farming, to the farmer and the family that's farming. And then you do away with the drudgery, then you'd have not only more profitable, more productive, diversified family farming operations, but you'd have more pleasant places to live, more time to spend with your family, more time to spend in the community. So I think there's a possibility. Technology, I wrote a piece one time, technology is good and bad. Well, some technology is bad when it's designed to do things that have bad outcomes. People say it doesn't matter, it's how you use it. But some technologies are developed in such a way that you can't fully utilize them unless you do things you don't want to do. And other technologies are designed specifically to do things that need to be done. So there's possibilities that technology could really implement a dramatic transformation in agriculture, just like it did in the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you. So we have a few questions on the Farm Bill, but I think this one probably would summarize it the best. What would you put into a Farm Bill if you had a blank piece of paper? How would you design it?
Well, I've been on record somewhere. What I would do would start with, I would transition these commodity programs, anything that has to do with subsidizing commodity, basically subsidizing a specialized agriculture, industrial agriculture, specialized, standardized, whatever. I would shift the specific commodity programs over to programs that support family farmers who are willing to make the transition or begin farming with what I call sustainable farming practice that address the environmental and the public health and the rural economic issues that I've talked about here tonight. If you put together a whole farm system, a plan for a whole farm system that moves you in that direction, then I would use this revenue insurance. They have a farm revenue insurance program now. I would turn that into a net farm revenue insurance program that would basically make up any shortfall in the family's net farm income. If they had off-farm jobs, that would count against the family income, so you wouldn't have to support that. But anyway, that's what I would do. And then that would give people then an opportunity to make this transition. You would be absorbing the risk of transitioning to a sustainable agriculture system, just like we're absorbing the risk of large-scale commodity production today. It would just be a change in the focus of what kind of agriculture we want. We would focus on the kind of agriculture we want, and we take the incentives away from the kind of agriculture that's causing the problems. And then it would be a voluntary kind of transition, because I think there's a lot of young people in particular, and there's a lot of these farmers out there that are getting anywhere from 75 to 90% of their income from off-farm sources that would like to be full-time farmers. The only reason they're not making any money farming, the only reason they're farming is because they want to farm. They basically subsidize the farm with off-farm income. I think a lot of those farmers would love to have an opportunity to transition to a farm that really fit what they want to do with their farm. So I think you would have a transition, but it would be a gradual transition where you'd have more and more of the government funds and programs going towards sustainable agriculture kind of programs, and you'd have less and less of the funds going to the commodity producers.
Follow-up question, but how do you make that happen when Big Ag has lobbyists influencing his politicians?
Well, I think one of the things that I've also suggested is we start doing it at the local level with local community-based food systems. I talk about the idea of food sovereignty. It says, okay, everybody has a right to a good, healthy, nutritious food that meets their basic needs for healthy, active lifestyles, and just declare that as a basic right within this community. And then that would allow you to use government food assistance funds. You'd have to go through the process of reallocating that within the community, to support the purchases that would make a kind of a foundation in terms of the demand or market for the food. But then the second part of food sovereignty says that you have a right to determine what kind of food systems you want. And I would apply that at the community level and say, okay, we're going to put together community-based food systems where we produce food in sustainably, culturally appropriate ways for our community, the way we feel good about, takes care of the land, that cares for the community, that produces good, nutritious food. And we're going to provide it to people within our local community. And we're going to give people an opportunity that are currently on government food assistance programs to have this good food that we're producing. We're going to make an opportunity to have it in the schools and things of that nature. And we'll allow other people to buy it at the price of whatever it takes to make it work. And then what I've talked about this is kind of a vertical cooperative. We're setting it up as a public utility, where what you do is you have consumers, you have processors, you have producers that are all a part of the system. And you say, we're going to put together a vertical system that works for everybody. We're going to adjust what we produce to what the consumers want, that we can produce at a price that they can afford to pay, and we're going to process it as locally as we can. And we have to cooperate with other areas to have a regional kind of network on the processing, things of that nature. But we're going to start at the community level. And then we're going to prove within the community that we can produce good, healthful, nutritious food that we can make affordable for everybody if we insulate ourselves from the industrial marketplace, the corporate marketplace. And that's the reason you need some sort of an organization like a public utility or cooperative or a B corporation that runs that whole vertical system, just like the vertical integration that worked in the corporate sector, except your objective is good, sustainably, culturally appropriate food for everybody.
I've always loved that idea. I'm gonna look at some CAFO stuff here. So what is your view of anaerobic digester producing natural gas from multiple CAFOs?
It's just continuing to support the industrial system of production. It's just another subsidy to firmly entrench the CAFO system more firmly than it is now, which makes it harder to get rid of. And the same is true of ethanol and the various other things that we have now. And I wanted to point out one thing. These policies that I've talked about, they've gone through all kinds of administrations, Democratic, Republican, both. There's differences between the two parties when it comes to kind of the language on what they do on environmental conservation issues. And they argue about how much money is going to go to food assistance versus commodity programs. But regardless of which policies, which party is in control, they always continue to give priority to this agricultural efficiency and productivity thing. That's basically their vision, is that's what agriculture has to do, produce as much as it can, as cheap as it can, regardless of whether it's Democrat or Republican. So I would hope, that maybe in the future we could move away from that and maybe challenge both parties on it. And so somebody asked me a question about Project 2025, and I said, well, it makes this objective more explicit, that what we want is an agriculture basic is free market, maximize productivity, maximize economic efficiency, and go that direction. So I would hope that we would have some opposition that would have to take a position that would be explicitly come out and say, we don't want those kind of policies. We want policies that actually support independent, diversified family farms, sustainable farming operations, regenerative agriculture, not big industrial controlled operations, not carbon trading, all this thing that corporations take advantage of, but things that will really support farm families in farming communities.
I'll take another one or two questions here. Here's an interesting one. Historically speaking, how did the animal agribusiness corporations become so powerful in the first place? Why didn't fruit and vegetable growers achieve the same kind of power and influence?
It said, how did the livestock operations?
Right. How did livestock operations become so powerful in the first place? Why didn't fruit and vegetable growers achieve the same?
Well, I think it's fruit and vegetable growers actually are. They just tend to be concentrated in California and Florida and places like that. In fact, in some of the earliest industrial agriculture, impacts of industrial agriculture in rural communities were done in California, back when they were moving in irrigated, fruit and vegetable production out into California, and they were bringing people, migrant labor and various other people in there. And there was I can't remember the names of the town now, but there were two different towns, and they analyzed one that was still dominated primarily by small independent family farms, and the other dominated by corporate agriculture. And then they documented the negative impacts on the community that was dominated by industrial agriculture. So it's been there. And then a lot of fruit and vegetable production has been under contract for a long time to the big corporations, and a lot of it's owned by the big corporations. I worked one summer before I started college. I worked in a pea cannery in Rochelle, Illinois. It's owned by Del Monte Company. So the Del Monte Company owned all these fields that were in green peas and pea sheller and pea cannery and all that kind of stuff. So you've had corporatization in fruits and vegetables for longer than we've had it in livestock. Livestock was more difficult to industrialize. When I was finishing my PhD, I went to a conference at Purdue University, and they were talking about moving hogs into CAFOs. And they said, okay, we've always had problems when we try to move hogs into CAFOs, disease problems and things of that nature. But soon after that, they started using antibiotics, and then that freed them up to move in that direction.
Okay, I'm going to end with this question. I think this is a good one to end with. What is the biggest hole in the argument for industrial agriculture? How can we undermine the pitch allure of industrial ag without farmers feeling attacked?
Well, I think that you can challenge the fallacies. One is that the industrialization of agriculture is necessary to keep food prices affordable for people. And you can point out the fact it's there in the statistics that since the 1990s, food prices have gone up faster than the overall price of inflation, than the overall inflation in consumer index prices. So industrial agriculture, this is the time of real corporatization, industrialization of the whole agri-food system. It hasn't led to lower food prices, it's led to higher food prices. And the other important thing is that during this period of time, and even earlier, going back to the 1970s, as we industrialized agriculture, we've had increasing problems of the health problems associated with agriculture. We've had the problem with an epidemic of obesity and heart disease and high blood pressure and a whole range of cancers that have been associated with the industrial food system. We've had all kinds of problems that are associated with the environment that have taken place during this period of time. And then the other thing is that we haven't fed the hungry people. We have more people that are classified as food insecure today than we had in the late 1960s when that CBS did a report on hunger in America. There was about 5% of the people at that time, that the best studies they could pull together, that was classified as hungry. Now it's about 11%. Even severe hunger today is about 5%. About, I think it's 13% of the children in this country live in food insecure homes. Industrial agriculture has been an absolute failure. It hasn't kept consumer prices down, hasn't fed the hungry people, and the people that can afford to eat is making them sick. It's time we change to something else.
And the industry really, as you were mentioning at the very beginning, you know, they proudly trumpet, we're feeding the world. But an environmental working group report, maybe about 10 years ago or so, found that, you know, our exports, you know, our US exports are feeding the top 20 countries that are getting our exports. Most of them are just the wealthy countries that can afford our.
And we export practically nothing to the 19 hungriest countries in the world. Yeah, so we're not feeding the world. And in fact, that's laughable when we burn up more than 40% of our corn in automobiles. And you take that 40% of the land that's produced fuel for our automobiles would feed millions of people around the world if we turned it into really producing food. And a lot of what we produce is feed for livestock that goes into these large CAFO operations, that those animals in most cases would be much better off, and we'd be much healthier if those animals were out on grass and doing the things that animals typically do. So there's all kinds of fallacies in this, and all these statistics I quoted here tonight, those are readily available online. Most of them are USDA statistics or Bureau of Census statistics and things of that nature. And economists have access to all those things. I blame economists for a lot of the problems that we have today, because these things are, you know, economists ought to be telling the truth about agriculture. And that's the reason, going on 85 years old, I keep doing what I'm doing, because I'm hoping, you know, that we have more and more economists that begin to dig into the statistics and basically tell the truth. I always tell people, you know, that the people that are opposed to what we're doing have a more difficult job, because they have to make up their stories and convince people that they're true. And all we really have to do is just tell the truth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, and that you just keep going strong, because it's really important, consequential. And I think we could talk for another half hour, an hour, but it's getting late, and I just think, you know, I want to thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I wish you all the very best there in Iowa, wherever people are listening from tonight. It's going to take, you know, all of us. And if, as I say, you know, if people disagree with me, that's fine. As you can see, I've changed my mind a lot in the years, and I think, you know, we need to be able to share our perspectives openly and together. Why, hopefully we'll get closer to the truth.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ikerd. Really appreciate you being here tonight.
All right, thank you.
And this will conclude our meeting. And I again want to thank Dr. Ikerd for making this time, giving us this really compelling talk for both JFAN and IRA. We've been recording the meeting. We're going to be posting it on the JFAN and IRA YouTube pages. And I encourage you to share this really valuable information with others who couldn't be here tonight. And I hope you can join JFAN in 2 weeks on Wednesday, August 7th at 7 p.m. Central Time, when we interview Joe Maxwell on the EATS Act, in early October during our annual meeting, and also join IRA in November when we focus on CAFOs and health. So just watch for information on all these meetings. And again, I encourage you to donate generously to JFAN during our annual fundraising drive. If you like meetings like these, if you like the work JFAN does on the community, state, and national level to protect Jefferson County and the state of Iowa, and really all of us from factory farms, then please help us meet our $27,000 match by September 1st. Your support keeps JFAN going strong for Jefferson County, for Iowa, and for you. So thank you all for joining us here tonight, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.